Royal Guard issues final warning. What happened next shocked everyone. Sergeant Thomas Whitmore stood tall outside Buckingham Palace, his back straight, eyes fixed forward, and not a single muscle on his face moving. Dressed in the iconic red uniform and black bearskin hat, he looked like a statue carved with precision. Tourists gathered around, whispering, taking photos, and pointing excitedly. Some tried to make him laugh. Others stood beside him hoping for the perfect selfie. But Thomas didn't blink, didn't smile, didn't react. He was a royal guard, trained to stand still and stay silent no matter what. Many people believed that the guards were just there for show, part of the ceremony and tradition. But that was only half the truth. Behind the stillness, behind the silence, were hours of training, strict rules, and deep dedication. Being a royal guard wasn't just about wearing a beautiful uniform. It was about representing the crown, keeping watch, and being ready at every moment to protect the palace. Thomas had been doing this job for over 10 years. He wasn't new to the routine. Every day he would get up early, polish his boots, press his uniform, and prepare mentally to stand motionless for hours. It was hard work, but he took pride in it. For him, it wasn't just a job. It was a calling, but not many people knew who Thomas really was. They saw the uniform. They admired the discipline. But they didn't know his story. Before he joined the Royal Guard, Thomas had lived a very different life. He had grown up in a quiet village in the English countryside. His father worked in a factory and his mother was a schoolteacher. Life was simple and peaceful. He had an older brother named James. The two were very close, sharing everything, from toys and secrets to dreams and fears. James was full of energy and always wanted to do something meaningful. He used to say, "I want to serve our country one day, Tom. I want to make a difference." And he did. James joined the military and was sent to serve abroad. Thomas remembered the day his brother left. They had stood by the old railway station, hugged tightly, and said goodbye with a promise to see each other soon. But James didn't return. That was the day Thomas changed forever. The news of James's passing was a quiet storm that tore through their home. Thomas didn't cry in front of anyone. He stayed strong for his parents, but deep inside he felt something shift. He didn't speak much after that. He stopped playing football with his friends. He avoided parties. Something had gone silent in him. Years passed, but the feeling didn't fade. One day, Thomas saw a group of royal guards on the television during a state event. They stood so still, so proud. Something about them felt peaceful. That night he looked up how to become one. He applied, trained hard, and eventually earned his place. Being a guard wasn't easy. The training was tough. He had to learn how to march in perfect sync, how to stand without moving for long hours, how to maintain complete focus even when people tried to distract him. But he never complained. In fact, he welcomed the challenge. It gave his life structure and purpose. Every morning when he stood outside the palace, he thought of James. He imagined his brother watching from somewhere far above, nodding in approval. Thomas never talked about him at work. He didn't tell his fellow guards. But every step he took, every order he followed, was done with his brother in mind. Tourists came from all over the world to see the guards. Some respected the rules, keeping a safe distance and taking quiet photos. Others didn't. They shouted, made faces, and tried to break the guards' focus. But Thomas never moved, not even a blink. People called him the Stone Man on travel blogs. His picture was posted everywhere online, but he didn't care for fame. His goal was simple: do his job, serve with honor, and leave quietly at the end of the day. Still, there were moments when he noticed things. A little girl dropping her ice cream and crying while her mother tried to cheer her up. An elderly couple holding hands and smiling at each other as they admired the palace gates. A young man nervously getting on one knee to propose. Thomas saw it all, though he never reacted. But inside, he felt connected to these people. They were living their lives, celebrating, laughing, loving. And he was standing there, a silent part of their story. Despite the silence, Thomas wasn't alone. He had fellow guards who respected him. They knew he was reliable. He didn't talk much in the break room, but when he did, his words carried weight. He never boasted. He never complained. He simply listened, nodded, and gave thoughtful advice when asked. Over time, people started to admire him not just as a guard, but as a person. One young recruit once asked him, "Sergeant Whitmore, how do you stay so focused out there?" As time went on, Thomas became one of the most experienced guards at the palace. He had seen many guards come and go. He had marched through rain, snow, and summer heat. His shoes had touched the same stones 1,000 times, yet every day felt meaningful. Every step was done with care, every position held with pride. He never looked for promotion, though he could have had one. He didn't ask for easier duties or shorter shifts. Some of his friends moved on to other roles, joined the police, or took office jobs, but Thomas stayed. And people began to notice that he wasn't just doing his duty, he was honoring something, maybe someone. Occasionally, people in the crowd would ask, "Why don't the guards talk?" Others would say, "He must be bored." But Thomas was never bored. His silence was full of purpose. It was the kind of silence that spoke louder than words. It told a story of commitment, of respect, and of quiet strength. Then one day something changed, but that is a story for another part. For now, Sergeant Thomas Whitmore stood in the same spot he had stood countless times before. The crowd was lively, the sun was shining, and the palace stood behind him in all its glory. Yet deep inside, Thomas felt a strange tension in the air. Something was different. He couldn't explain it, but years of discipline had sharpened his senses. He stood still like always, but behind that stillness his mind was alert, watching, waiting. Because when you wear the red coat and black hat, you are not just part of a tradition, you are part of a promise. A promise to protect, to serve, and to stand tall no matter what. And Sergeant Thomas Whitmore never broke a promise. The sun had just started to rise above London, painting the sky with a soft orange glow. Buckingham Palace stood quietly, its stone walls shining gently under the early morning light. Birds chirped in nearby trees, and the city slowly began to wake up. Inside the Royal Guard's quarters, Sergeant Thomas Whitmore prepared for his shift. His red uniform was neatly ironed, and his boots shone like mirrors. He checked every detail carefully, buttons, straps, gloves, nothing could be out of place. He had done this hundreds of times, but today something felt different. Thomas couldn't explain it. There was a strange feeling in his chest, like a quiet warning. He wasn't afraid. He had felt many things over the years, tiredness, cold, heat, even sorrow, but this was new. It wasn't something he could see or touch, it was just there. Still, he followed his routine as always, calm and focused. Outside the palace, a crowd had already started to gather. Tourists from different parts of the world stood behind the iron gates, holding cameras, waving flags, and chatting excitedly. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, trying to catch a glimpse of the famous guards. Today was a special day. The changing of the guard ceremony was scheduled to happen in full style. Music, marching, and the beautiful rhythm of tradition. It was all part of what made Buckingham Palace such a magical place to visit. At exactly 10:45 a.m., the guards began their march. The sound of boots hitting the ground in perfect harmony echoed through the courtyard. Thomas was at the front, leading with his usual calm strength. His face was unreadable, his posture perfect. Everything seemed normal. The band played softly in the distance. A light breeze passed through the crowd. People clapped quietly as the ceremony continued. But Thomas's eyes were scanning the scene. He didn't move his head, didn't turn, but he noticed details, tiny ones that others might miss. He saw a woman holding a baby and smiling gently. He saw an elderly man wiping a tear from his cheek. He saw a boy waving a small flag with both hands. These were the peaceful moments he loved, simple human joy in the middle of all the ceremony. Then he saw something else. A young man, maybe in his 20s, was moving quickly through the crowd. He wasn't dressed like a tourist. No camera, no phone out, no smile. His face looked tense, and he was holding a large backpack. Thomas's training kicked in. He didn't panic. He didn't make any sudden moves, but he paid close attention. The man was speaking to people nearby, showing them something on his phone. Some looked confused. Others shook their heads and stepped away. It wasn't clear what he wanted, but he was making people uncomfortable. Thomas continued to watch, though still completely still. The man started moving toward the front, closer to the palace gates, his steps quickening. Security staff nearby noticed him too and began to speak into their radios. Within moments, the man reached the front barrier, where only a few feet separated the crowd from the guard line. That's when things changed. Instead of stopping, the man stepped past the barrier. Gasps came from the crowd. A few people backed away. The man raised his voice, saying something that no one fully understood. He lifted his arm, pointing at the palace, then turned to the guards. And then he took one step closer. For most people, this would be just a confusing moment. But for the guards, especially Thomas, it was serious. Guards were not allowed to speak. They were trained to stay still. But they also had orders. If someone crossed the safety line and if that person ignored a clear warning, action could be taken. Thomas didn't want to overreact. Maybe the man was just confused. Maybe he meant no harm, but the rules were clear. His training was clear, and most of all, his instincts were sharp. The young man reached for his backpack again. Thomas had seen enough. For the first time in years, he spoke while on duty. In a voice that was calm but firm, he said something the crowd never expected to hear. "This is your final warning. Step back immediately." Silence fell across the courtyard. People looked around in disbelief. Had a royal guard just spoken? The man didn't move. His hand hovered over his backpack and he seemed unsure now. The crowd watched in stillness. Phones were raised. Cameras captured every second. Thomas's voice had not been loud. He hadn't shouted. But the words had carried power. They came from a place of deep training, calm control, and quiet strength, and they had stopped the man in his tracks. Suddenly, two uniformed security officers appeared from the side and walked calmly toward the man. They began speaking to him, gently guiding him away. He didn't resist. He looked confused, maybe even embarrassed. In the end, the backpack had only contained personal items, books, clothes, and a water bottle. No danger at all, just a misunderstanding. But the moment had been real. The tension, the uncertainty, it had all been very real. The crowd slowly began to talk again. Whispers turned into comments and comments turned into applause. People weren't clapping because of fear. They were clapping because they had witnessed something rare. A guard had broken tradition to keep people safe, and he had done it with calm dignity. Thomas didn't react to the applause. He didn't nod or smile. He simply stood still again, returning to his position as if nothing had happened. But inside, he felt something shift. He had followed the rules. He had kept people calm. He had done his duty. But more than that, he had reminded everyone that behind the uniform stood a human being, a person who cared, who watched, and who knew when the moment called for action. Back in the guards' quarters after the ceremony, the mood was quiet. No one teased or laughed like they usually did. Thomas took off his gloves and sat down for a moment. One of the younger guards, who had been in his first week of service, looked at him and said softly, "That was incredible, sir." Thomas gave a small smile. "Sometimes you just have to trust your training," he replied. Later that evening, the video began to spread online. Thousands watched as the red-uniformed guard spoke those few words. People commented with praise, admiration, and even surprise. "Royal Guard breaks silence," the headlines read. "Final warning stuns crowd." But Thomas didn't care for the attention. He didn't check the news. He didn't go online to see the video. For him, it was just another day on duty. He had done what he was supposed to do, and that was enough. He walked home quietly that evening through the calm London streets. The sky was now painted in shades of purple and pink. The same palace stood tall behind him, and the same city lights flickered to life. As he crossed a small bridge over the river, he paused. The water below flowed gently. For the first time all day, he let out a deep breath, and for just a moment he looked up at the sky and thought of his brother James. He knew James would have been proud. Not because of the video or the attention, but because of the reason behind it. The decision to speak had come from courage, not fear. From responsibility, not ego. From respect, for duty, for the people, and for the place he had sworn to protect. Tomorrow would be another day. Another shift, another crowd, but today had been different, and deep inside, Thomas knew that something had changed, not just in him, but in how people saw the guards. They were no longer just statues in red coats. They were quiet protectors, watchful, thoughtful, human. And sometimes, even the quietest voice can make the biggest impact. The next morning, the city of London felt a little more curious than usual. News of what had happened outside Buckingham Palace the day before had quickly spread. Videos of the silent royal guard speaking to a man had gone viral. People were talking on buses, in cafes, even in quiet corners of the underground. But inside the palace grounds, things remained as they always were, calm, disciplined, and respectful. Sergeant Thomas Whitmore stood once again in position. The same red coat, the same black bearskin hat, the same straight posture. He didn't look left or right. He didn't show any emotion. To a tourist, he seemed just as he had always been, a silent figure from a time-honored tradition. But inside, something had changed. He wasn't thinking about the video or the comments online. He hadn't even seen them. He was thinking about the weight of the moment, how quickly things could turn from peaceful to uncertain, and how important it was to stay grounded when they did. His fellow guards had given him quiet nods that morning, a small sign of respect in a place where words were rarely used during duty. Nobody made a big deal of it, and that was just the way Thomas liked it. But despite the calm surface, the memory of the day before was still fresh in his mind. He could still picture the young man with the backpack, the fear in the crowd, the moment he had to speak. He had trained for years to stay silent. He had stood in every kind of weather, faced noisy tourists and busy crowds, and had never broken form. But yesterday he had chosen to speak, and now the world was watching. Later that afternoon, Thomas was asked to visit a small office within the palace. It wasn't a punishment. In fact, the officer in charge had a kind smile and a calm voice. "You handled yourself very well," the officer said. "There was no harm in what you did, quite the opposite, in fact." Thomas nodded. "I just followed my instincts, sir." "Well, your instincts may have done more than you think," the officer continued. "The way you kept the situation calm, how you spoke clearly and confidently, that's not something we can teach easily. You represented us with dignity. We're proud of you." Thomas didn't say much. He never did, but hearing those words gave him a quiet sense of peace. As the days passed, more people began visiting the palace gates. Some were curious to see the guard who had spoken. Others just wanted to be part of the moment. There were drawings from schoolchildren, thank-you notes tucked into the fence, and even handmade cards from visitors who said they felt safer because of Thomas's actions. One morning, a small envelope was handed to the guard captain. Inside was a letter from a woman who had been at the palace with her 2 children during the incident. She wrote that her little daughter had been scared, but when the guard spoke calmly, the fear went away. She thanked him for staying strong and kind in a moment of worry. The captain read the letter out loud in the break room. No one said anything at first. Then someone quietly said, "That's Sergeant Whitmore for you." Thomas was in the corner, polishing his boots, listening silently. He didn't respond, but a small smile touched the edge of his lips. It wasn't about praise. It was about knowing that doing the right thing had made someone feel safe. That meant everything to him, but not everyone understood. A few people online had said the guard should have stayed silent. That tradition was more important than breaking character. Some news articles debated whether what he had done was proper. But Thomas didn't let those voices get to him. He knew the truth. He hadn't broken rules. He had acted out of care with calmness and control. Still, something deeper was going on inside him. As more days passed, Thomas began to reflect on more than just his duty. He thought about his brother, James, about promises made years ago, about what it truly meant to serve. It had been many years since James had passed, yet not a day went by when Thomas didn't think of him. In the stillness of each shift, when the world moved around him and he remained motionless, he often felt close to his brother. It was in that silence that he could remember him fully, his laugh, his ideas, his courage. Thomas wondered what James would have said about the recent events. Maybe he would have joked about it. Or maybe he would have simply nodded, proud that his younger brother had remained calm and strong. One evening, after his shift had ended, Thomas took a quiet walk through St. James's Park. The sky was soft with the colors of sunset, and the path was nearly empty. He walked slowly, his hands in his coat pockets, breathing in the cool air. He stopped near a small bench by the lake and sat down. Ducks floated gently on the water. The world was peaceful again. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a silver pin shaped like a star. It had belonged to James. It wasn't part of his uniform, and he never wore it at work, but he always kept it close. Looking at the pin, Thomas whispered, "I spoke, James, just once. I hope you'd have done the same." A quiet breeze moved the leaves around him, and for a brief moment he felt like his brother was sitting beside him. Back at the palace, changes were happening. The guard leadership had begun discussing new training procedures. They wanted to include more realistic situations, like the one Thomas had faced, so that future guards would know how to respond with both confidence and calm. They asked Thomas if he would be willing to share his experience. He was surprised. He wasn't used to speaking to groups. But he agreed, not because he wanted attention, but because he believed it might help others. A week later, in a quiet training room, he stood in front of a group of young recruits. They sat in rows, their uniforms freshly pressed, faces full of focus. Thomas cleared his throat. "I've been standing outside that palace for over 10 years, he began. Most days are quiet. Most days you don't move, you don't speak, you don't react. But that doesn't mean you stop watching. It doesn't mean you stop caring. He paused, then continued. When the moment came, I had a choice. I could follow tradition exactly, or I could use what I knew, my training, my judgment, and take one small step to keep others safe. I chose the second, and I'd do it again. The room was silent. Not because they were bored, but because they were listening deeply. Thomas wasn't trying to inspire them, he was just sharing the truth. Your silence is powerful, he said, but it doesn't mean your heart is silent. You'll understand that more and more as you stand out there. When he finished, a few recruits approached to thank him. One said, "You've given me a new way to see the uniform." That evening, Thomas walked home through the same quiet streets. Lights twinkled in windows, and the city moved gently around him. He passed a newsstand with a photo of a royal guard on the front page. He didn't stop to read it. He didn't need to. For him, the story wasn't about going viral or becoming famous. It was about staying true to his duty, to his instincts, and to the memory of someone he loved. He didn't speak often, but when he did, it mattered. And now people had begun to listen, not just to what he said, but to what he stood for. After a few weeks, the crowd outside Buckingham Palace had grown larger than usual. People from different countries stood shoulder to shoulder, hoping to see more than just the beauty of the palace. They were there to see the guard who had spoken, the one who broke tradition in the most respectful way. But Sergeant Thomas Whitmore didn't act any differently. He wore the same red uniform, stood in the same position, and followed the same routine. To him, nothing had changed. His focus was still on his duty, the palace was still under his watch. And the people who came to see him were still visitors he promised to protect, without ever saying a word. However, behind the scenes, everything was changing. The Royal Guard unit had never seen this much public attention before. Emails poured in from schools, newspapers, and even people who had seen the moment online and wanted to send a note of thanks. Some said Thomas reminded them that kindness and courage still existed. Others simply said they had never seen someone so calm and respectful under pressure. Many asked for interviews. Some wanted to film short documentaries. A few even offered awards. But Thomas quietly refused them all. He didn't do what he did for fame. He didn't feel like a hero. He believed he was simply doing his job, and the attention, while kind, made him uncomfortable. One morning, his commanding officer pulled him aside. "You've been requested to attend an event at the community hall," the officer said. "Local families and schoolchildren would like to meet you. Nothing formal, just a small gathering." Thomas was quiet for a moment. He didn't like to be in the spotlight, but if it gave him a chance to thank the people who supported him, he thought it was the right thing to do. So on a calm Saturday morning, Thomas wore a simple suit and went to the community hall in central London. It wasn't a large place, just a cozy building with old brick walls and big windows that let the sunlight pour in. Inside, chairs had been set in neat rows. There were handmade signs saying, "Thank you, Sergeant Whitmore and our quiet hero." Children stood near the windows, holding paper drawings of guards with big hats and red coats. Some had even tried to draw his face with kind eyes and a gentle smile. As Thomas entered, the room went still. Then slowly the applause began. It wasn't loud or forced. It was warm, honest, and full of respect. Thomas gave a soft nod and a grateful smile. He shook hands with people, posed for a few photos, and answered simple questions from the children. One small boy asked, "Weren't you scared that day?" Thomas knelt down to meet the boy's eyes. "Not scared," he said gently. "Just careful. When we care about people, we stay calm so they don't have to be afraid." A little girl handed him a handmade card. On it, she had drawn a big heart and the words, "You made us feel safe." Thomas held the card for a moment, touched by its simplicity. "Thank you," he said quietly. After the event, he walked home alone. The streets were quieter now, the sun low in the sky. He felt something deep inside, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't pride or excitement. It was peace. Not long after, Thomas was invited to visit a nearby school. The teachers said the students had been deeply inspired by the story of the guard who spoke. They had written essays, drawn pictures, and some even said they wanted to grow up and serve their country. Thomas agreed to visit. He didn't prepare a speech. He didn't dress fancy. He simply showed up, shook hands, and listened. He walked into a classroom where children sat wide-eyed, waiting for him to speak. He stood at the front of the room and looked at all the small faces filled with curiosity. "Do any of you know what a royal guard does?" he asked with a smile. A few hands shot up. "You stand very still," said one boy. "You protect the Queen," said another. Thomas nodded. That's right, we do stand still and we protect important places, but most of all we watch. We notice things, we listen even in silence. The children leaned forward. They weren't bored. They were learning something deeper than they expected. He told them about the importance of paying attention, about how quiet strength can sometimes speak louder than words. He didn't mention medals or praise. He spoke about duty, respect, and calm. Before he left, the teacher handed him a folder filled with letters from the students. Thomas promised to read every single one. And he did later that night, sitting by his window with a cup of tea and a warm blanket. Each letter was different, but they all shared one thing: gratitude. One letter said, "I didn't know guards could talk. Now I know they can also be heroes." Another read, "Thank you for not being afraid. You make us feel strong too." These words touched Thomas in a way nothing else had. He placed the letters carefully in a box with his most important memories, alongside photos of his family, his old military badges, and a postcard James had once sent from overseas. Though he still stood silently at his post each day, something had changed in the way people looked at the guards now. They weren't just symbols anymore. They were people, thoughtful, calm, and full of quiet courage. And it wasn't just Thomas. The entire unit felt the change. During one afternoon break, a younger guard approached Thomas while they were polishing their boots. "Sergeant," the young man said, "I used to think our silence meant we were just background, but now I know we're part of the story. You showed us that." Thomas didn't say much. He simply nodded, his eyes kind. "We've always been part of it," he said. "Sometimes it just takes one moment to remind people." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the palace walls, Thomas stood at his usual post. Tourists gathered like always. Cameras clicked. Children pointed and waved. But this time, the air felt different. It was as if everyone was watching with a little more respect, a little more wonder. They weren't just looking at a uniform. They were looking at a man who had quietly shown the world that strength didn't always come with loud voices or grand gestures. Sometimes it came in a whisper, sometimes in a warning spoken gently, and sometimes in the way someone stood still, day after day, holding on to a promise made long ago, not just to serve, but to care. Thomas didn't need medals or parades. He didn't want speeches or banners. He only wanted to continue what he had started years ago. And now, more than ever, he knew that even the smallest action done with heart could leave a lasting mark. Time passed quietly, just the way Sergeant Thomas Whitmore liked it. The excitement of that unforgettable day outside Buckingham Palace slowly faded from headlines. The videos stopped trending, the online articles moved on to newer stories, and the crowd sizes returned to normal. But the memory of what happened that day, and how Thomas had calmly handled it, remained in the hearts of many. Even though life outside the palace gates carried on, something inside the Royal Guard unit had changed for good. Thomas continued to serve with the same dedication. He still polished his boots with care, wore his uniform with pride, and stood tall in front of the palace. But now his presence felt even more powerful. People no longer saw him as just a guard. They saw him as a symbol of quiet strength, calm under pressure, and gentle courage. New recruits who joined the Royal Guard were told about Thomas during their training. Instructors used his story to teach about instinct, discipline, and human kindness. Not only how he spoke, but why he spoke. They learned that guarding wasn't just about tradition. It was about awareness, wisdom, and knowing the right time to act. And Thomas. He never let the attention change him. He still took the same route home, stopping at the same corner bakery for a warm bun and tea. He still greeted the old man who sold newspapers near the train station. And he still visited the quiet park bench near the lake whenever he wanted to reflect. But even quiet people grow older. After nearly 15 years of standing outside one of the world's most famous landmarks, Thomas knew it was time, not because he was tired or bored, but because he had served well, and it was time to let younger guards take his place. He submitted his retirement request with a handwritten letter, simple, respectful, and full of gratitude. On his final day in uniform, the morning air was cool and the sky was painted with soft clouds. Thomas stood outside the palace one last time, exactly as he had for so many years. Visitors didn't know it was his last shift. There were no announcements, no grand goodbyes. Just the sound of footsteps, soft wind, and camera clicks. But among the crowd stood a few familiar faces, his fellow guards, his commanding officer, even a few of the schoolteachers who had once invited him to speak. No one said anything. They didn't need to. When the ceremony ended and Thomas marched back inside the gates, he paused for a moment. He looked up at the grand palace behind him. It was a place he had come to respect deeply, a place that had changed him, and in many ways a place that helped him heal. That evening, the guards gathered in the common room. There was a small cake, a few polite speeches, and a photo album filled with memories from his years of service. But the most meaningful gift was a simple wooden box. Inside the box were letters not from newspapers or officials, but from his fellow guards. Each one had written a note to Thomas, sharing how he had quietly inspired them. Some talked about his patience, others about his calm nature. One guard wrote, "You taught me how to stand still with purpose." Thomas read each note carefully, and when he finished, he gently closed the box and smiled. In the days that followed, Thomas moved back to the small countryside village where he grew up. The pace was slower there. The fields stretched out for miles, and the air smelled of grass and wood smoke. His parents had passed on, but the old family home still stood. He fixed it up, planted flowers in the garden, and made a small room just for books, memories, and quiet. He wasn't the kind of person to sit around doing nothing. So he began volunteering at the local school, sharing stories with children about service, respect, and discipline. Not through big speeches, but through simple moments. He showed them how to stand with good posture, how to listen carefully, how to stay calm even when things around you felt confusing. The children loved him. They called him Mr. Whitmore the Guard. Some even started practicing walking like him in the playground, arms swinging in straight lines, heads held high. One afternoon, a teacher invited Thomas to speak at an assembly. He stood in front of a small group of students and said, "Some people think being strong means shouting the loudest. But sometimes the strongest person is the one who stays quiet, listens, and does what is right without needing to be seen." The room was silent. Every child listened carefully. They weren't just hearing a man speak. They were learning from someone who had lived every word he said. Back in the city, the Royal Guard added a small plaque near the barracks. It wasn't flashy, just a simple wooden sign that read, "In honor of Sergeant Thomas Whitmore, who reminded the world that silence can protect, calm can lead, and doing the right thing, quietly, is still one of the bravest acts of all." Tour guides sometimes pointed it out, sharing the story of the guard who gave a final warning. Visitors would nod, surprised to learn that behind the uniform had been a man who spoke only when it truly mattered, and in doing so had changed how people saw the Royal Guards. Forever. Back in his village, Thomas lived a peaceful life. He enjoyed morning walks, warm tea, and the joy of watching the seasons change. Children often stopped by his gate with drawings or cookies. He always thanked them, shared a story, or gave them small lessons about honor, kindness, or standing tall. Every now and then, someone would recognize him. They'd ask, "Aren't you the guard who spoke?" He'd smile gently and say, "Just doing my job." But deep inside, he carried that day with him, not for the attention, but because it reminded him of his brother James. Sometimes at sunset, Thomas would sit by his window and take out the old silver pin shaped like a star. He'd hold it in his hand, thinking of James and the promise he had made to serve with honor. He knew James would be proud, not because Thomas had become well known, but because he had stayed true. True to his duty, true to his quiet strength. True to the belief that one calm voice can bring peace, even in uncertain times. And so the story of Sergeant Thomas Whitmore didn't end with applause, awards, or bright lights. It ended just as it began, in silence. A powerful, respectful silence. One that carried the weight of a promise kept, a duty fulfilled, and a legacy that would whisper through the palace gates, the classrooms, and the hearts of those who heard it, for many years to come.